Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Yarnell. I am the head of Data and Bioinformation Services at the Health Sciences and Human Services Library. So, welcome to our final Love Data Week event for 2026. This has actually been the seventh annual Love Data Week that we have celebrated together here at UMB. The theme of this year's Love Data Week is Where's the Data? And so today we are going to introduce you to an important resource for sharing qualitative data. And before I introduce our speaker, I just want to say a few words about the HSHSL Data and Bioinformation Services Department, which is hosting this event. So our goal in the Department of Data and Bioinformation Services is to support researchers at all stages of the data lifecycle, from the time you start planning a project through collecting and analyzing data to sharing and preserving data. We offer various levels of support. So if you prefer something like a more self-service model, you can always visit our website and read up on a variety of data-related topics. We also host workshops and presentations like the one you're in today. We also do more in-person, hands-on type workshops. We offer consultations for one-on-one support. And we also can collaborate in a more in-depth way as time allows on projects and grants. So if you're interested in learning more about data services, you can use this QR code here or this link, and it will take you to more information to our website. You can also find us from the HSHSL homepage. So you're always welcome to reach out to me. My email is arnell@hshsl.umaryland.edu. Or if it's easier to remember, you can go ahead and email data@hshsl.umaryland.edu. And let's see. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and I am going to now introduce our speaker. And Desi, feel free to get your slides up if you like while I do that. Um, so I am so pleased to introduce today Desi Kirilova, who has been at QDR, the Qualitative Data Repository, since its founding more than a decade ago. And she is currently the repository's associate director. Over the years, she has assisted in shaping the repository's policies, acquisitions outreach, curatorial support for depositors, including dealing with human participants and copyright constraints, data management trainings, and the original curation and publication of all commissioned pilot projects when the repository went live in 2014. Trained as a journalist and a political scientist, her current interests are in educating fellow social science and other researchers in good data practices. Starting in the earliest planning stages, she also serves as a key lead for QDR's own academic research agenda, studying and publishing widely on scholars' perceptions and knowledge of responsible data sharing options, qualitative data curation best practices, the role of IRBs, journals, and funders in the data sharing ecosystem, and improving informed consent for ethically and legally sharing sensitive human participant data. So please join me in welcoming Desi. And if you have questions throughout, you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A feature, and we will be sure to cover them at the end of the presentation. So thanks so much, Desi.
Thank you, Amy, for the introduction and inviting me to be part of Love Data Week on your campus virtually. Thank you, everyone else, for joining. As Amy said, I will definitely try to leave time at the end for questions. But the way I've structured the presentation also hopefully will cover some kinds of questions or some items that are already you might have as questions in your mind, because the way I've chosen to do it is to highlight with real practical examples from QDR how various things that people wonder about can be done. So that's kind of my whole take on the topic of organizing and archiving qualitative data with QDR. A lot of the things that I say will be generally applicable to all kinds of data. Again, I know that the audience is probably researchers and young scholars or students who might do various types of research. And I hope, even though I'm personally representing the qualitative data repository, that a lot of the general comments that I make will be helpful to you in whatever type of data you work with. So to give you, sorry, I'm having trouble advancing my slides. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. What is QDR? For those of you who may not have come across us before, the Qualitative Data Repository is an online digital repository that is dedicated to the storing, preserving, publishing, and the enabling of download of digital data, specifically generated through qualitative and multi-method research in the social sciences. Now, that remains our mission on paper, but for the more than a decade that we've been around, we've really expanded the scope of disciplines that we serve. Some of this was intentional. We started in political science, but really always wanted to expand beyond that across the social sciences. But some of it was a little bit organic and maybe a bit unexpected by the original founders, which is that people started finding us from not directly social science disciplines, but disciplines like public health, education, that have a lot of things in common with qualitative research in the social sciences, but have really other questions or other approaches that they study. And we discovered that our services and expertise are actually really applicable and well positioned to serve them as well. So we don't have a strong requirement that people come from any one specific discipline. We assess each proposed deposit kind of on its own merits and how well it fits our growing catalog. We are headquartered at Syracuse. Again, that's somewhat incidentally, because one of the original founders was a professor here, but we do serve people across the United States. We have institutional members like University of Maryland at Baltimore. Our IMs are also across the United States, and we have more and more depositors as well as secondary users from other countries as well. We currently have 235 data projects published, and we have another about 600 that are in progress. And I'll explain in a little bit what that means, but just to give you a sense that people contact us more and more at the very beginning of their planning a new project. And that's really what we recommend. That would be another big kind of takeaway of my presentation, is that the time to start thinking about the eventual potential sharing of your data, which will happen after the end of your project, but the time to start thinking about it and planning for it is at the very beginning. And so when I say that we have these 600 plus other projects in motion, that means people who have committed to data sharing, who have consulted with us and planned for it, but are either currently still collecting their data, or maybe they've completed the collection, but now they're cleaning up and preparing the data for deposit and eventual curation. So we help and consult throughout the whole life cycle, kind of just like Amy said, the local data services, of course, does, because it's really, really important. That's hopefully one takeaway that everybody takes from our conversation today, is that the time to start thinking about data sharing is before you've begun your project. And I'll explain, and you'll see examples of why that is the case, why so early. We have institutional membership, and while a depositor or secondary user does not need to be an institutional member to work with QDR, there are various benefits that I will address towards the end of the talk. And we have been continuously Core Trust Seal certified, which doesn't mean much to most researchers and you don't need to know what that is, but it is within the digital repository space, literally the seal of approval that we are thoughtful about the preservation of the data, the security of the data, our curation processes, and the long-term sustainability of the materials that we steward. So that's just very briefly what we are institutionally. And here is a first kind of look at what types of data are shared via QDR. The middle of it is what we call our bread and butter. 90% of the deposited materials, because of our particular focus on qualitative data, 90% of the deposit and published materials are in the form of either focus group or individual interview transcripts. And this is kind of what they commonly look like. Then we do have various other types of studies, some using archival materials that then have been digitized for the purposes of preservation and sharing, such as this item here on the left, which came from JFK's pre-presidential personal diaries that somebody collected, studied, and so on, and then eventually deposited with us. We have some videos like the one that you see a screenshot of at the top, and then various administrative materials that maybe didn't start out as data, but because of the way that they were selected and analyzed by a researcher became data. So a variety of things, and that really illustrates the richness and diversity of what constitutes qualitative data. We, as a repository that's focused on this type of with these types of approaches, can really work with a wide variety of formats and the way the data originated. It really doesn't matter to us. We can consult on how to make them in the most appropriate way shareable with others. Sorry, I just keep having trouble navigating my slides. Apologies for that. Just very quickly, something that probably those of you who are active researchers are aware of, but just to give a kind of a sense of the changing data landscape. So while previously doing data sharing was much more of an ad hoc and kind of personal endeavor for some people who chose and thought that that was important for the advancement of scholarship to share their data, now it's become much more of a clear and formal requirement. So just to give two very prominent examples, both big federal funders, the NIH and the NSF, have a very explicit data sharing expectation, and certainly a data management and sharing plan requirements. So while the data sharing is a strong expectation, there are possibly reasons why it could be justified that data would not be shared or be only shared partially or in some specific abstracted form. So there's more choice there, but to fill out and attach to a grant application a data management and sharing plan where these considerations are described, as well as the general approach to managing the data during the course of a project, that is a requirement. That is not something that's optional. And we can talk if you have questions specific about either of those funders. I gave a similar presentation a couple of weeks ago, and this had just come out, so I felt the need to include it. Basically, over time, what we have observed with these data sharing expectations by funders is that the language has gotten stronger, more specific, more comprehensive. And so the NSF's most recent policy revision, it didn't really change anything substantively. The same expectations that I just reviewed are there. But look at how it's phrased in the new policy revision. Recipients are required to share all data supporting NSF-funded publications at the time of publication. So it kind of clarified the timeline here, which the NSF was never as clear on as the NIH had been. And exceptions to the sharing requirement should be described and justified within the data management and sharing plan. So these, while the policies are changing on the margins, they're only getting stronger, and the expectation being that people will plan for and achieve the most appropriate form of data sharing for their research data. But aside from meeting these funding requirements, I'd like to discuss a little bit more about the why of shared data, the way we see it at the repository. And it really has to do with the potential uses after the data are shared, right? I don't want you to think, okay, I know I have to fit this one new requirement now in my normal research practices. Hopefully, by seeing some examples of what happens with the shared data, what beneficial uses people put them to, that gives you some inspiration and motivation to maybe try thinking about the data that you produce, how they could be deployed in these ways. So here are, again, just a big picture kind of justification from the NIH saying that the sharing of scientific data really enhances the rigor of the immediate project, because people are thinking about what they do and the data that they collect or produce, how they will be made available to others. So that kind of strengthens their own practices in the course of their work. But then eventually, it's the data reuse for future research purposes that magnifies the benefit of the initial investment by the funder. The types of uses that we see regularly with the variety of data that we have already published are secondary analysis and collaboration. And I'll give you some specific examples, even with published things that are done on the basis of already published data. Then the transparency for specific publications, that's from the original depositors. Teaching and training, which is a huge secondary benefit of data being shared, and qualitative data does not have that tradition where teaching students, instructing them in qualitative methods with authentic, real qualitative data is common. That's just not typically the case. But there's no reason not to do it now that we have more shared data. And we encourage and work with people who are looking for specific pedagogically appropriate projects. And then giving back to participants and communities, we're actually seeing more depositors who tell us, we want, maybe our data would otherwise be more restricted for research purposes, but we do want our participants, if they want to come see the aggregate collection that we made with their help, to be for that to be facilitated. So those are some interesting new uses of the shared data that we're seeing as well. And then kind of in a more normative sense, not going back to over-research the same communities over and over if other researchers could maybe use the original data that somebody collected. That is a theoretical benefit. Let's say that one we don't easily, we don't know how to measure that easily, but we see that the potential of that as well. So here's some examples that I wanted to highlight, as I said, in real life. We'll talk about this one particular study because not only is it very interesting and a great example of appropriately shared sensitive human participant data that QDR has published, it just so happens that the depositor, the PI who conducted the study, is a colleague of yours at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. So I feel that it's particularly appropriate to highlight that real world case. But while it is on a sensitive topic, and it's about people who have I guess, gone through prostitution diversion programs. So very sensitive topic with personal experiences and so on. It is shared with appropriate restrictions with the identification. Again, we'll actually illustrate that in a few minutes further in the presentation. And it is often the access to these data is often requested by people who want to do secondary work because the materials are so rich. And again, as long as people meet the specific requirements, they are authorized to do that. And here's an example of somebody who was able to produce a master's level thesis based on a reanalysis of these data with a new question in mind that they had. And this is an academic work that would not have been produced had these data not been made available for secondary users. So this is kind of the secondary user reflecting and commenting on what they did with the data. Another type of reuse in practice that we're seeing is collaborative secondary analysis. So here's an example where the person who, the secondary user who decided to reanalyze the data actually also decided to invite the depositor to be a co-author with them. They, found the data in QDR, requested the access, decided what they're going to work on, but then also decided they would truly benefit from collaborating with the original people who originally collected the materials. That was not a requirement of any kind. They could have just continued on their own and done their publication, but they chose to co-author with the original depositor. So we're seeing that kind of collaborative secondary analysis as well. On the more methodological front, developing and contrasting methodologies where a group of people who are experts in different qualitative methodologies use the same data set to kind of hone in on what their particular approach can or has limitations with. This was a project of that sort where a group of methodologists wanted to highlight exactly that, and they found an appropriate data set to do this sort of exercise within QDR as well. This one actually is on a topic kind of from public health sciences. That the access to these data is not as restricted as some of the early examples that I gave you. And so we actually wouldn't have known necessarily that this happened, except that the person who convened that methodological group wanted us to know. And they published a special issue where each of the different approaches with which people analyze these data was kind of given its own article. And it was an interesting comparison and contrast methodological approach. Then teaching, which I already mentioned, the pedagogical value of shared qualitative data is really amazing. We field about, I would say, 50 to 60 inquiries a year where somebody has actually reached out to us to ask us to help them an appropriate project or to ask us how they could best have their students involved to use authentic qualitative data. And again, we know that there are many more people who do this without necessarily contacting us and being able to find the data on their own. But this is one early example where the professor who had gotten help from us, again, gave us a little reflection on how it went. He described which project at QDR he assigned to his students, and was pretty pleased that he has continued doing this for many years now. So teaching, pedagogy, secondary research, collaboration, all of those are uses of the data, which hopefully inspire you to think about doing that with your own current or future projects. So sharing qualitative data allows you to be a good colleague, a good teacher, a good citizen of academia, as well as to meet funder requirements, journal requirements. We also have a lot of research now that shows that across different disciplines, published data actually get additional citation visibility and attention separate from the articles that come out of them by the original depositors as well. So all kinds of reasons, hopefully, to motivate further data sharing, including of qualitative data. Now to the more nitty-gritty question of how. And now for this brief presentation, I can't go into all the various things that one needs to keep in mind, but I will highlight the general kind of concepts and approaches that you should keep in mind. Number one, and I already kind of alluded to it, you have to start thinking about the data sharing bit early on, as well as think about it holistically as an integral part of your research project. Because for you to prepare the data in a way that would be appropriate for sharing, that would be understandable to others, that means that you are doing actually excellent data management that would first and foremost help you and your team during the course of the project. Those two things really feed into each other. And so in a more selfish way, you're helping your own research and your own team if you are also focused on the data sharing possibilities, because that would guide you to develop conventions that, especially when you're working with a team, I know that's not everybody's situation, but often is, even if you just have one research assistant, the more clear instructions you can use across the team, the easier then it becomes for you to use these data for the analysis piece. Once they're fully collected, the easier it becomes to manage them, the easier it becomes to make sure that you have appropriate backups because you have planned for all of that in advance. And not just kind of gone into the project more haphazardly, as sometimes happens when people don't choose to sit down and have that data management kind of mindset from the beginning. Planning and organization is critical. So again, big topic. We can give many examples or talk about many specific instances of what that means, but sitting down and thinking, okay, I know that I'm going to do the project in this way. I'm going to have these types of sites, for example, if you have multiple sites, or I'm going to revisit this population, this study group that I'm using multiple times. So I'm going to have several phases of interacting with them, or whatever the setup of your study is. Just use that to also plan the structure of your storage spaces for folder names, file names, and so on. Develop, very simple, but develop file naming conventions that then can be immediately applied as each data piece gets created, so that you are not then wasting time, honestly, renaming things in a more consistent manner, because from the beginning that structure was not there, and file naming convention didn't capture the kinds of attributes to the files that you may find useful. Consider data security and access. So this is where figuring out how much storage space do I need during the course of the project. Does it need to be particularly secure? What resources do I know that I have, or maybe I don't know, but I can ask from my local university IT team. What are we maybe required to use? Because many universities actually have a particular requirement, and that knowing that in advance will help you not just meet the requirement, but ensure that you have the appropriate amount of storage as well as level of security, if that's relevant to your types of data. And then access, again, with the mind or with a thought towards the eventual sharing, access after the end of the project is something that you should be thinking about early on, so that you can decide what types of potential secondary users you think would be okay to access these data, define them in some general sense, and then write out that description of what types of potential uses you will be authorizing or imagining for these data, and relate that to your human participants if you're working with human participants, right? That's super important. And that's one of the additional reasons why I appeal to you to start thinking about eventual potential data sharing early on, so that can be embedded in your informed consent process. All of those things that I'm saying need to be documented, right? So making the decisions is the first step. And most of them, again, they really are captured in these several categories here. They're not difficult decisions, but they are things that you have to make a decision on early on, and then capture that decision in documentation. So this is where the last block there comes in handy. Create documentation regularly throughout the project. You will not remember things. I'm sure, again, any of you who have already engaged in any form of research agree with that. You will not remember things the way you think you would, even a few months down the line. So that's why everything needs to be documented, and then it becomes a reference point for you yourself to consult. What did we decide on this? How are we supposed to, organize our files? What is our backup procedure, and so on? So documentation early on. If it needs to be amended, obviously, a new version of documentation is worth creating, but starting with a comprehensive set of documents for yourself to guide your processes in your interactions with the data. And so all of the things that I described before really are something that you can do on your own if you're working in an individual capacity or with your team. So why work with an entity like QDR or some other repository? This is the where. So where should data be shared eventually? They should not be shared, or they should not be sitting on your computer and you just write in your article, okay, data will be shared upon request. That is not nowadays, that is not an acceptable or contemporary way of signaling transparency or willingness to share the data. That may have been the case, maybe 15 years ago when the infrastructure for appropriate data sharing for many types of data didn't exist. There was always some form of sharing, but more limited. Nowadays, there are a variety of repositories that can accommodate a variety of data types and kind of substantively different data from different domains. So you should identify what is the best repository for your particular type of project and the data that you're producing, and work with a professional venue, so a repository of some sort. And here are some of the key benefits of working with a repository. Repositories, to start with, produce digital object identifiers for the shared data, so stable links, often in the form of DOIs, that then become part of the citation for the data, not something that an individual researcher can do, or honestly should be burdened to figure out how to do. That's what a professional repository would help with. They guarantee long-term digital preservation. So part of what we do as a regular part of our work at QDR is reviewing the formats that materials are published in, and assessing when some kind of reformatting or upgrading of the formats needs to happen for long-term digital access. Meeting institutional requirements, as I said, that's, for example, the journal and funder requirements. Data management planning and curation assistance. Now, that is not every repository doesn't do that. QDR is certainly a fully curated repository. So you get assistance in sharing the data well, not just slapping them somewhere on a website and calling that sharing. Repositories also work very hard on their own, the findability of their catalogs, their own kind of behind the scenes functionalities that enable searching and finding of the appropriate data. So that makes your data more visible and easier for others to discover and access and cite as they use them. And then provide things like access controls, embargoes, any of these restrictions that are often relevant, in particular for qualitative data. All of that together sometimes is summarized under the acronym FAIR data. And again, you may or may not have heard of that, but just to know that repositories allow you to make your data FAIR, the acronym, findable, accessible, interoperable, and truly reusable by others. I wanted to quickly say, even though, again, I'm representing QDR, and that's what our focus here is in this conversation, but there are many other repositories. There are self-deposit generalist repositories, appropriate for many types of data. I would argue not appropriate typically for qualitative human participant data, but you should be aware that for other types, you could just do a self-deposit. There are institutional repositories that some universities have that can handle data. They're not, institutional repositories really were set up originally for publication sharing, but some are also equipped to do data sharing. Domain and disciplinary repositories, and that's what QDR is an example of, as well as places like ICPSR, Databrary. Then there are some hybrid ones, which are sort of generalist in the generalist category, but provide some basic curation. And then there are some specialized repositories that are sponsored as well as required to be used by specific funders. Typically, if you're funded by one of the many institutes of the NIH, you will be directed to a specialized repository if the institute has one. And by the way, so, oops, sorry, I'll go back to this for a second. Sometimes people are not sure, okay, I know that there are these many repositories. I don't know which one I really should work with. That's what your local librarian could help, data librarian could help you with as well. Now I'm going to jump into some more examples of projects published on QDR to again illustrate the wide variety of approaches that one can take, and the fact that qualitative data sharing in particular is not an all or nothing proposition, that there are nuanced ways to handle some of the biggest concerns really and legitimate concerns that people have when it comes to qualitative data sharing. So I will start again with that wonderful example by Professor Steimer, who is, as I said, faculty at UMB. Actually, I should mention something else. This was her first project deposited and published with QDR. She since then has had a second one, which is kind of a follow-on a research project, going back to some of the stakeholders of the first one and doing additional new interviews with new questions that is also published on QDR. So I'd like to think that her experience from the first one made her comfortable, and that she appreciated the process and the way we handle interactions with depositors. So the second deposit, I think, strengthens the argument that we're a good place to work with. So just to illustrate here that in this particular case, as in many where controls and restrictions are appropriate, the documentation of the project is available, so people can see the questionnaires used, the informed consents used, some of the guides to the internal team, but the data themselves are fully de-identified and then also additionally restricted. So access to them requires submission of a research plan, submission of a data security plan, coordination of how long the data will be used, and so on to qualify for access. And that's a pretty typical approach. By the way, I'm seeing questions in the chat. Amy, I'm not sure. Do you want me to stop and look now, or?
Oh, yeah, that's actually just me
That's
putting
you.
in some
Okay.
links. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
That's fine. That's fine. I just didn't want to leave things unaddressed if people did want to ask questions right away. All right. Here's another example, which also I was able to find. This is a large research team, and one of the co-authors here is or was at the time anyway, a person at the nursing school, nursing program at UMB. But it's a big kind of collaboration within the consortium called Palliative Care Research Cooperative Group. And that was a very interesting group which came to QGR wanting to have easier facilitated data access within their group. So they wanted anybody who's a member of PCRC to be able to access the data that the qualitative data in particular, that anybody else in the consortium has had collected, because again, they are all united around the same topical focus. And so this is one example. There are 10 plus others, but as I said, this is a colleague of yours, one of the co-authors anyway. So that's why I wanted to give an example. But here is, again, the graduation of access restrictions and the nuanced sharing that I already mentioned. So within the consortium, the restrictions are lower. As long as you're a member, that's considered qualification. If you're not part of the consortium, potentially you can request access, but it would be a higher hurdle to meet the requirements. Here I wanted different examples now, not any more people at UMB, at different universities, but here's an interesting example where the researchers didn't think about data sharing right at the beginning somehow, and they started doing their interviews for this study, but then somehow in the still early phases, they became aware of the possibility, decided that it's something that they want to do, and essentially revised their informed consent to address that data sharing piece, to ask for permission by the participants, went back to their IRB to get that approved, because obviously that's a major amendment from the original plan, then continued with the remainder of the interviews. And of the people who had already been interviewed before the change of protocol or before the data sharing piece was added, three people refused to participate, to have they participated in the study, but they refused to have their data shared. And so in the deposit, they basically just explain, documentation again. They explain, this is what happened. This was our, trajectory to data sharing. Most of the people agreed. Here are their deposited transcripts. Some people did not agree. And so we did not share their materials. So that's, again, a very reasonable and recommended, in fact, approach, not to do a reconsent, but even if you do it from the beginning, to do an opt-in, opt-out option, even with the understanding, okay, maybe I'll lose some of the transcripts for data sharing. I'm not going to lose these participants for my study. I would still be able to use their information for analysis. Sometimes, for various reasons, again, whether it was because data sharing was not envisioned from the beginning, or they just chose to capture the data in this more abstracted form, data can be shared in a more abridged form. So here somebody shared field notes, basically summaries of their interviews, and not the actual full transcripts. And as I said, I don't remember in this particular case, but I have seen both reasons. Sometimes people do this because they just never fully transcribed the interviews. They didn't need that for their own purposes. So what they had was these summaries. That still enhances the transparency of their work and is worth depositing even in this abridged form, even though obviously from the various uses that we talked about, potential secondary uses, only some are applicable to abridged data. Here again, the graduated access happens actually within the study. So this is a very rich multi-method project that people did on the kind of mental health perceptions and access to mental health care within a particular immigrant community. And the interview transcripts are under more complete, let's say, restriction. But then there are quantitative surveys where there's much less possibility for re-identification of the participants. Those are shared under less restriction. And again, documentation of how the study was done, which can teach somebody a lot as well, that the documentation is shared completely without restrictions, which is typically QDR's approach on documentation. And I'm going to stop with the examples with this very fantastic, very rich, interesting project done again with a large collaboration of co-authors across the US, where they set out to create essentially what they thought of as a digital archive of immediate kind of contemporaneous reflections of the early months and years of the COVID pandemic. So it was called the Pandemic Journaling Project. The way data were collected was basically via digital journaling, which came in various shapes. Some people wrote daily and weekly entries according to a prompt. Some people chose to record audio. Some people chose to send pictures and videos. So super, super rich, different, diverse formats, but very personal. And especially the audio video, not really de-identifiable. So the de-identification piece can't really happen easily. So appropriate restrictions are applied. But again, people can, who are seriously intending to study either all or some component of these data, can qualify. In this case, because there's identifiable information, part of the requirements is even secondary IRB review of the potential secondary project. And we have some people who have qualified even to these fairly restrictive conditions and are in the process of reanalyzing these data, which, as you can imagine, they're so rich. The original PIs, they have multiple articles already out and they continue working on it, but they know that it's, I would not say inexhaustible, but there's much, much more to do there to really exhaust the contents and richness of these data. So they're very excited, the original depositors, to see others use them for questions that maybe they don't have interest or time to explore. So all of those are, examples both of real world projects that hopefully speak to you in some capacity, whether topically or whether in kind of the approach that the depositors took. But also they're examples of how even potentially sensitive, quite, personal materials can be shared in an appropriate manner. So just to reiterate, really, our repository's general take on responsible sharing, we are very much aware of those concerns. We know that that's primary in qualitative researchers' minds. We feel very confident in our capacity to work with individual potential depositors to work out kind of the best conditions that they should be, that their data should be shared under. and apply these nuanced, fine-grained restrictions, if necessary, to the files that it's necessary for, and kind of keep the ethical concerns that are second nature to qualitative researchers to the forefront, but also give them their due without making them prohibitive to all forms of data sharing. So we try to strike that right balance is the bottom line and kind of our overall approach. Again, I already alluded to some of these things. The slides will be shared for you to use them as further reference when you maybe are starting to think about the potential data management and sharing in your projects. But very, very important thing to remember, that's one reason to do the planning up front, because whatever you say in your data management plan, whether it's submitted formally to a funder or whether it's just internal to your team or yourself, it has to align with what you say in your IRB application. We see, unfortunately, sometimes still conflicting language, where in the data management and sharing plan, there is a plan for sharing some or all of the data. In the IRB language or in the informed consent language that was approved by the IRB, it says only the researcher will ever see these data. So that's a very big problem and conflicting language that we recommend you do not find yourself in that position, that you think about those two pieces, again, holistically, where they go together, and the commitments that you make to your participants are the same commitments that you make to your funder. So I'm going to skip some of this to, again, give you a real life example. I do feel that people learn best in that manner when you just have to listen to me, at least to see kind of how others have handled these things. Another interesting study whose data are published via QGR on a very personal, again, sensitive topic, experiences with abortion and other reproductive care provisions. Here, the study, consent was whatever it was, and then there was an optional piece for data sharing, and this is what it read like. Do you agree to allow a written copy of your interview, so a transcript, right, in other words, to be shared with other researchers in the future? Yes, no. And with this sensitive topic in this particular study, with this additional optional consent, 92% of the responders agreed. So again, similar kind of to what I gave you the example with before. Some people may not feel comfortable with that, even with de-identification, even with controls, even with explaining that the data will only be used for non-commercial research purposes. Those are typically the main concerns that participants have when it comes to data sharing. But even with all of that care, some people might opt out of data sharing. That's perfectly fine. Then it just becomes part of the documentation. This is what we did. This is how many people we interviewed. This is how many transcripts are being shared. This is the reason why some are not being shared. There's, often there are many questions about de-identification with qualitative data. Yes, it's doable. Yes, it's time consuming, and it's not something, yes, there's some tools, and we advise people if they want to try using a tool as kind of a first cut of de-identification, there's some tools that can help, but ultimately that's something that only really the original data collector can do best, because they know the context in which the data were collected. And with qualitative materials, it's not just the direct identifiers. Those are the easiest to kind of flag and redact, but then there's a lot of triangulation or indirect identifiers that need to be considered. And we in our curation process give advice on kind of how to approach that. But ultimately, it's only the original data collectors that can make the ultimate decisions of how to preserve the analytic value and context while removing the specific identifiable elements. We do have multiple examples of de-identification protocols now. This used to be our first one, which is why I still use it in presentations. But very rich, very interesting project that was done in Latin American countries. And basically the depositors wrote down for their own purposes, but then eventually made a documentation that's truly instructive to others, how they chose to de-identify certain elements of the transcript while preserving the references across transcripts, which actually was very important for their project, which was all about kind of network analysis. So you want to have some of that preservation of references. And that's a particularly tough case really for qualitative de-identification, yet we think that they did it very well. And for the rest of us, there's much to learn from the de-identification protocol, which is why I highlighted here. And it's by far one of the most downloaded kind of single pieces of documentation. And we think it's because people are learning from that. With the controlling access, I gave you already multiple examples. I'm going to quickly go through this, but the idea is that with qualitative data, we're not aiming for open data in the technological sense, where you click a button and, or a secondary user clicks a button and they are presented with the data. This is not typically appropriate for qualitative materials, which is why QDR does not, as a matter of course, actually publish data under open license. We abide by the motto as open as possible, as close as necessary, and we work out with you, the depositor, the potential depositor, the specifics of what level of restriction is necessary, what level of qualifications for potential secondary use. But for all of that to happen, you have to start planning for it from the beginning of your projects. So I'm going to go very quickly to the benefits that you get as an affiliate of the University of Maryland. We do these curation consultations that I keep mentioning from these very early stages of planning. So actually, by far, the best kind of interaction happens when somebody approaches us as they're planning their grant proposal. Again, if you're in that situation where you're working with on funded projects, when you're planning your grant proposal, which, especially if it's to these federal funders, will have the data management and sharing plan requirement. If you contact us then, as well as possibly your local data librarian and data resources, to work out some of these decisions that you have to make on data management, we then can advise, give examples, talk with you through some of the stickier points, let's say in the specifics of your study. That is a free consultation for, really anybody, but including people at institutional member universities. Now, when the deadlines come around, we know very well because we get a lot of them. So affiliates like yourselves get priority consultation. That's one big benefit, that you will be guaranteed to talk to someone and get feedback on your data management and sharing plan by whatever deadline that you're trying to meet, external or internal. Then at the end of the project, when hopefully all the data were collected in a manner that makes them appropriate for sharing, when you come back to QGR, and we understand and know that that's typically several years down the line, you receive, in that very early discussion, we also discussed what the curation fee would be, given the volume, complexity, specifics of your data. And institutional member affiliates receive a 20% discount on our typical cost. That, again, is money that should be written into your grant proposal anyway. For people who do not have the privilege to work on funded grants, oftentimes dissertation work, or other unfunded work, we do offer waivers for institutional members. So that's the curation and storage happens for free for them. And then we offer also, and we have done certainly with some qualitative instructors on your campus, virtual class visits for more in-depth discussion, especially with graduate students in qualitative methods classes. Those are some of the benefits. I do recommend, because you have such wonderful local resources, that you can start your discussion or planning of eventual data sharing by contacting Amy, again, whom you saw. You know how to reach her. This is her email address and her whole unit. But start those conversations early on. That's the biggest takeaway that I hope you leave here with. So I'm going to stop here, and we believe have a few minutes where maybe I can take questions.
Thank you
Feel free
so
to.
much.
I was just going to say, feel free to write them in the chat or take yourself off mute. I think everybody can do that individually, and
Yes.
if you want to ask it verbally, that's great too.
Yeah. We're not a huge group, so feel free to unmute yourself. Thank you so much while you're thinking of your questions. Desi, that was really helpful. Such wonderful information there. QDR is such a great resource.